Shabbat Shalom. One of the last people who was executed in the state of California was a man by the name of Stan Tukey Williams. Some of you remember it was December of 2005. David and I were pretty new to California at the time, and I remember that I could barely believe that this progressive state still had a death penalty with hundreds of people on death row. Stan Tukey Williams was one of the founders of the Crips, and he was convicted of 4 murders back in the 80s. But in his time in prison, he went through what everybody called a dramatic transformation. Speaking out against gang violence, he started giving lectures and writing memoirs to try to convince young people to abandon violence and pursue a path toward an honest and meaningful and peaceful and enriching life. So I was one of many, many people fighting for the governor to accept Stan Tukey Williams' clemency request. For me, the question really wasn't about whether he did it or not. It was whether or not the state had the right to end a person's life, a living, breathing, flawed being created in God's own image. And if that were not enough, there was also evidence that Williams had really changed, that he wasn't the person that he was in the 80s anymore. Not only did he no longer pose a threat to society, but he could be uniquely positioned to open hearts and minds because he knew the pain of a life of violence. And I remember really believing that we would get clemency. Clearly, Williams would do more for the world alive than dead. And I was absolutely devastated when the governor denied the clemency request. So Williams was executed on December 13th of 2005. But there's another word for the willful and premeditated killing of a human being, whether that's carried out by a gang member or by the state, and that's murder. In the days that followed the execution/murder of Stan Tukey Williams, I was in a haze of grief. What devastated me was the fact that he did not need to die. And I couldn't understand how a nation that is considered the most religious and most devout in the world could not spare any concern for the life of a grown human being doomed to die at the hand of the state. I wanted justice, but my heart was aching too for compassion. I'm thinking a lot about Stan Tukey Williams these last couple of weeks because the incoming administration has made it clear that their intention is to end the death penalty in the United States, at least to end the federal death penalty. And maybe that's why the outgoing president seems to have prioritized a rush of executions in his final days in office. On Thursday night of this week, a man named Brandon Bernard was killed for a crime that he participated in when he was 18 years old. And some of you have read the accounts of this murder, double murder that he participated in. The stories are always awful. Bernard was convicted and he spent 17 years on death row. He was locked in his cell alone 23 hours a day for 17 years. And in the course of that time, he changed. His lawyers, even the prosecutors who originally fought for his case, recognized that he was full of remorse for the role that he played in that crime and that he'd grown up. He became religious. He guided and supported other prisoners. He learned how to crochet. He started making sweaters. And he's dead now because the Supreme Court and the president decided this week not only that his life wasn't worth saving, but that it was justifiable to murder him. He wasn't a hero and he wasn't an angel, but he was a living sentient being who was 18 years old when he made the worst mistake of his life. And they went forward with that execution this week, despite the fact that it's been 70 years since the federal government has executed someone who was that young when they committed their crime. They went forward with the execution despite new evidence that has come up recently indicating that Brandon's role in the crime was more limited than they originally thought. In the rush to take this man's life, that information was not deemed relevant. They went forward with the execution despite the indisputable racial bias in the administration of the death penalty in this country, despite the well-established truth that public safety is not enhanced by the death penalty, but is undermined by it. Despite the fact that in the United States, as Brian Stevenson has said, we have a system of justice that treats you better if you are rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent. Wealth, not capability, shapes outcomes in the United States. And despite the fact that most of the nations of the world have abolished the death penalty, recognizing the inherent cruelty and injustice built into the administration of the death penalty, they executed this man. Despite all of this, they went forward with this execution this week, and then another one the next night, and they will likely execute several more death row inmates before this administration is through, all in our name. The story of Hanukkah, the way that it's told in the Gemara and the Talmud, is a story of miracles, and in particular, it's a story of the miracle of lights. The Gemara asks, "My Hanukkah, what is Hanukkah?" And the rabbis teach in Masechet Shabbat that the answer to that is that when the Greeks entered the sanctuary, they defiled all of the oil that was in the sanctuary. And ultimately, when the Hasmonean monarchy overcame them and emerged victorious, they searched, but they only found one cruse of oil that still had the seal of the high priest on it. There was only enough oil, as you all know, to last for one night, but a great miracle occurred, and it lasted for 8 days. And that's why so many years later, we sing songs of praise and we light the Chanukiah in our own home. The military victory, the war that was fought between the Maccabees and the Greek Syrians who destroyed our sacred space, it's mentioned, but our rabbis dramatically de-emphasize it. There's no mention in this version of the story that the Talmud tells of the strong being delivered into the hands of the weak, the many into the hands of the few, the impure into the hands of the pure, the wicked into the hands of the righteous, like we just said in our Amidah, in our prayers. We just talk about the lights and the great miracle that happened so many years ago. Why is that? Because even though the Maccabees were rebelling against persecution, and even though they faced an existential threat, they were defending their people from murder and from oppression. And our tradition honors those who fight for the survival of their people. It's even a religious obligation. Even still, our rabbis were profoundly uncomfortable with the tactics and the values of the Maccabees and the Hasmonean dynasty, their descendants who followed after the Maccabean revolt. First, the book of First Maccabees tells the story of Mattathias, who is compared to Pinchas from the Torah. He murders another Jew who's attempting to offer a sacrifice in an act of idol worship, and then tears down the altar. And throughout the books of Maccabees, the Maccabees are celebrated for engaging in these kinds of acts of extremism, either leading to self-harm or even suicide, acts of incredible violence against other people. And so too the dynasty that comes after them. After defeating the Greek Syrians, the Maccabees establish a theocracy that's rife with violence and corruption. They and their descendants engage in acts of extreme violence against other Jews who don't share their theological and political commitments, and also against other people as well. And this is not who we are supposed to be, our rabbis seem to be saying. We're not proud of that behavior. So instead, they work to limit the influence and the example of the Maccabees. And they favor the humble quest for survival over zealotry. They reject blind religious fervor that turns us into the very extremist forces that we're trying to overcome. The rabbinic story on Hanukkah is a rejection of extremism, instead focusing on a simpler, more faithful narrative that just lifts up the miracle of the light. And yet, as I've learned with some of you this week, it's just a little bit more complicated than that, because listen to what happens in the Talmud. The rabbis teach that the mitzvah of Hanukkah is actually fulfilled by one light being lit per household each night of Hanukkah. And then the Mahadrin, the frum Jews, the really strict observant Jews, those people will have one light lit each night by each member of the household. So in the Miko Levine household, there would be 4 candles lit every night for 8 nights. And then the Talmud tells us that only in the Mahadrin Mina Mahadrin, the firmest of frum Jews, the most extreme, the most stringent and religious and observant Jews, only those Jews will light multiple lights every single night, and maybe even per person. I have to tell you that this is one of those rare cases in which every single one of us who lights a Chanukiah, from the most religious to the most disconnected, marginalized, alienated, secular Jews, we all follow the practice of the Mahadrin Mina Mahadrin, of the firmest of the frum Jews. We all observe the most extreme position. We light 1 light the first night, 2 the second, 3 the third, 4 the fourth. And if you're like us in our household, we have 5 Chanukiot, and each person in our household is lighting multiple candles every night. Tonight, there will be 5 Chanukiot, in which there are 3 lights representing the 3rd night of Hanukkah. And tomorrow night, there'll be 4 lights on each of those Chanukiot. Isn't it interesting that for leaders who are invested in countering extremism, the extremism of the Maccabees, the violent extremism, the whole community has essentially chosen the most extreme position when it comes to Hanukkah? But it's not violent extremism that they choose. In what way are we extremists today? We're extremists in bringing more light to the world. The act of lighting the Chanukiah is, and it has been throughout history, an act of resistance against unjust regimes, against unjust laws, against unfair circumstances. We are told that we are to be bearers of a light, of truth, of hope, of the possibility of a different way, even in the darkest of times. We were talking about Brandon Bernard last night at Shabbos dinner, and Sammy, my daughter, had sent us a link earlier in the week to try to put pressure on the White House to offer clemency in advance of this execution. And we had a conversation about whether or not our calls and our petitions and our organizing made or could have made a bit of difference in this case. And what should we do in the coming weeks, knowing that there are more executions that are scheduled before Inauguration Day? How can we keep hope even when we realize that sometimes our best efforts will not succeed? It made me think about this teaching that my dear friend, Rabbi Shai Held, offers. And I offer this today as part of a prayer for his refu'ah, for his healing of body and spirit, Harav Shai Aviad ben Balfura. Shai says that in understanding our mission to the world, we have to keep in mind that stars in the sky don't eradicate darkness, they mitigate darkness. They don't turn the world into a palace full of light. They only shed light in places that would otherwise be consumed by darkness. So we have to be wary of the fantasy that our job is to remove all of the darkness from human life. Such notions, he says, are chimerical at best and unimaginably dangerous at worst. But to take the covenant between God and Israel seriously, to take our Jewish life seriously, is to affirm that we can and we must bring light into otherwise abandoned places, that we can bring moments of meaning and companionship to places that are overrun by heartache and devastation. We can't eradicate the darkness, but what we can do, what we must do, is soften the threat of night, soothe and ease the pain of the world, even though we can't obliterate darkness and eliminate sorrow. He says we can't bring an end to darkness, but we can soften its effects. I want to offer this to us on this Shabbat Hanukkah, that our work is to mitigate against the darkness by bringing light. And in our effort to do that, we are told that we are to be extremists, mahadrin min ha-mahadrin, above and beyond the simple gestures and the basic decencies, to exert ourselves with everything we've got to soften the threat of the night. If we've learned nothing else over these past years, it's that sometimes even our best efforts will not make miracles happen. And even still, that doesn't free us from doing something, because sometimes our best efforts are the miracles themselves. So as you light this week, I invite you to think about what it means for us to engage in our best effort, our fullest exertion, for the sake of mitigating against the darkness of our times. We're not only to kindle lights, but to become lights, to embody the light. We cannot eradicate the darkness, but in some way, each of us and all of us doing whatever we can surely soften that darkness and help bring about a new era of light for all of us. Shabbat Shalom.